Goodbye, My Brother, by John Cheever. Published in the New Yorker, August 17th, 1951. We are a family that has always been very close in spirit. And when I said goodbye to my brother Lawrence, it was with a deep sense of loss. Our father was drowned in a sailing accident when we were young, and our mother has always stressed the fact that our familial relationships have a kind of permanence that we will never meet with again. I don't think about the family much, but when I remember its members and the coast where they lived and the sea salt that I think is in our blood, I am happy to recall that I am a Pomeroy, that I have the nose, the coloring, and the promise of longevity, and that while we are not a distinguished family, we enjoy the illusion, when we are together, that the Pomeroys are unique. I don't say any of this because I'm interested in family history, or because this sense of uniqueness is deep or important to me, but in order to advance the point that we are loyal to one another in spite of our differences, and that any rupture in this loyalty is a source of confusion and pain. We are 4 children. There is my sister Diana and the 3 men, Chatty, Lawrence, and myself. Like most families in which the children are out of their 20s, we have been separated by business, marriage, and war. Helen and I live on Long Island now, with our 4 children. I teach in a secondary school, and I am past the age where I expect to be made headmaster, or principal, as we say, but I respect the work. Chatty, who has done better than the rest of us, lives in Manhattan, with Odette and their children. Mother lives in Philadelphia, and Diana, since her divorce, has been living in France. But she comes back to the States in the summer to spend a month at Lod's Head. Lod's Head is a summer place on the shore of one of the Massachusetts islands. We used to have a cottage there, and in the 20s our father built a big house. It stands on a cliff above the sea, and excepting Saint-Tropez and some of the Apennine villages, it is my favorite place in the world. We each have an equity in the place, and we contribute some money to help keep it going. Our youngest brother, Lawrence, who is a lawyer, got a job with a Cleveland firm after the war, and none of us saw him for 4 years. When he decided to leave Cleveland and go to work for a firm in Albany, he wrote Mother that he would, between jobs, spend 10 days at Lod's Head with his wife and their 2 children. This was when I had planned to take my vacation. I had been teaching summer school, and Helen and Chatty and Odette and Diana were all going to be there, so the family would be together. Lawrence is the member of the family with whom the rest of us have the least in common. We have never seen a great deal of him, and I suppose that's why we still call him Tifty, a nickname he was given when he was a child, because when he came down the hall toward the dining room for breakfast, his slippers made a noise that sounded like Tifty, Tifty, Tifty. That's what Father called him, and so did everyone else. When he grew older, Diana sometimes used to call him Little Jesus, and Mother often called him the Croaker. We had disliked Lawrence, but we looked forward to his return with a mixture of apprehension and loyalty, and with some of the joy and delight of reclaiming a brother. Lawrence crossed over from the mainland on the 4:00 boat one afternoon late in the summer, and Chatty and I went down to meet him. The arrivals and departures of the summer ferry have all the outward signs that suggest a voyage: whistles, bells, hand trucks, reunions, and the smell of brine. But it is a voyage of no import, and when I watched the boat come into the blue harbor that afternoon and thought that it was completing a voyage of no import, I realized that I had hit on exactly the kind of observation that Lawrence would have made. We looked for his face behind the windshield as the cars drove off the boat, and we had no trouble in recognizing him. And we ran over and shook his hand and clumsily kissed his wife and the children. "Tifty!" Chatty shouted. "Tifty!" It is difficult to judge changes in the appearance of a brother, but both Chatty and I agreed, as we drove back to Laud's Head, that Lawrence still looked very young. He got to the house first, and we took the suitcases out of his car. When I came in, he was standing in the living room, talking with Mother and Diana. They were in their best clothes and all their jewelry, and they were welcoming him extravagantly. But even then, when everyone was endeavoring to seem most affectionate, and at a time when these endeavors come easiest, I was aware of a faint tension in the room. Thinking about this as I carried Lawrence's heavy suitcases up the stairs, I realized that our dislikes are as deeply ingrained as our better passions. And I remembered that once, 25 years ago, when I had hit Lawrence on the head with a rock, he had picked himself up and gone directly to our father to complain. I carried the suitcases up to the third floor, where Ruth, Lawrence's wife, had begun to settle her family. She is a thin girl, and she seemed very tired from the journey. But when I asked her if she didn't want me to bring a drink upstairs to her, she said she didn't think she did. When I got downstairs, Lawrence wasn't around, but the others were all ready for cocktails, and we decided to go ahead. Lawrence is the only member of the family who has never enjoyed drinking. We took our cocktails onto the terrace so that we could see the bluffs and the sea and the islands in the east, and the return of Lawrence and his wife. Their presence in the house seemed to refresh our responses to the familiar view. It was as if the pleasure they would take in the sweep and the color of that coast, after such a long absence, had been imparted to us. While we were there, Lawrence came up the path from the beach. "Isn't the beach fabulous, Tifty?" Mother asked. "Isn't it fabulous to be back? Will you have a martini?" "I don't care," Lawrence said. "Whiskey, gin, I don't care what I drink. Give me a little rum." "We don't have any rum," Mother said. It was the first note of asperity. She has taught us never to be indecisive, never to reply as Lawrence had. Beyond this, she is deeply concerned with the propriety of her house, and anything irregular by her standards, like drinking straight rum or bringing a beer can to the dinner table, excites her in a conflict that she cannot, even with her capacious sense of humor, surmount. She sensed the asperity and worked to repair it. "Would you like some Irish, Tifty dear?" she said. "Isn't Irish what you've always liked? There's some Irish on the sideboard. Why don't you get yourself some Irish?" Lawrence said that he didn't care. He poured himself a martini, and then Ruth came down and we went into dinner. In spite of the fact that we had, through waiting for Lawrence, drunk too much before dinner, we were all anxious to put our best foot forward and to enjoy a peaceful time. Mother is a small woman whose face is still a striking reminder of how pretty she must have been, and whose conversation is unusually light. But she talked that evening about a soil reclamation project that is going on up island. Diana is as pretty as Mother must have been. She is an animated and lovely woman who likes to talk about the dissolute friends that she has made in France. But she talked that night about the school in Switzerland, where she had left her 2 children. I could see that the dinner had been planned to please Lawrence. It was not too rich, and there was nothing to make him worry about extravagance. After supper, when we went back onto the terrace, the clouds held that kind of light that looks like blood, and I was glad that Lawrence had such a lurid sunset for his homecoming. When we had been out there for a few minutes, a man named Edward Chester came to get Diana. She had met him in France, or on the boat home, and he was staying for 10 days at the inn in the village. He was introduced to Lawrence and Ruth, and then he and Diana left. "Is that the one she's sleeping with now?" Lawrence asked. "What a horrid thing to say," Helen said. "You ought to apologize for that, Tifty," Chatty said. "I don't know," Mother said tiredly. "I don't know, Tifty. Diana is in a position to do whatever she wants, and I don't ask sordid questions. She's my only daughter. I don't see her often. Is she going back to France? She's going back the week after next. Lawrence and Ruth were sitting at the edge of the terrace, not in the chairs, not in the circle of chairs. With his mouth set, my brother looked to me then like a Puritan cleric. Sometimes, when I try to understand his frame of mind, I think of the beginnings of our family in this country, and his disapproval of Diana and her lovers reminded me of this. The branch of the Pomeroys to which we belong was founded by a minister who was eulogized by Cotton Mather for his untiring abjuration of the devil. The Pomeroys were ministers until the middle of the 19th century, and the harshness of their thought, man is full of misery and all earthly beauty is lustful and corrupt, has been preserved in books and sermons. The temper of our family changed somewhat and became more light-hearted, but when I was of school age, I can remember a cousinage of old men and women who seemed to hark back to the dark days of the ministry and to be animated by perpetual guilt and the deification of the scourge. If you are raised in this atmosphere, and in a sense we were, I think it is a trial of the spirit to reject its habits of guilt, self-denial, taciturnity, and penitence. And it seemed to me to have been a trial of the spirit in which Lawrence had succumbed. "Is that Cassiopeia?" Odette asked. "No, dear," Chatty said. "That isn't Cassiopeia." "Who was Cassiopeia?" Odette said. "She was the wife of Cepheus and the mother of Andromeda," I said. "The cook is a Giants fan," Chatty said. "She'll give you even money that they win the pennant." It had grown so dark that we could see the passage of light through the sky from the lighthouse at Cape Hirion. In the dark below the cliff, the continual detonations of the surf sounded. And then, as she often does when it is getting dark and she has drunk too much before dinner, Mother began to talk about the improvements and additions that would someday be made on the house. The wings and bathrooms and gardens. "This house will be in the sea in 5 years," Lawrence said. "Tifty the croaker," Chatty said. "Don't call me Tifty," Lawrence said. "Little Jesus," Chatty said. "The seawall is badly cracked," Lawrence said. "I looked at it this afternoon. You had it repaired 4 years ago, and it cost $8,000. You can't do that every 4 years. "Please, Tifty," Mother said. "Facts are facts," Lawrence said, "and it's a damned fool idea to build a house at the edge of a cliff on a sinking coastline. In my lifetime, half the garden has washed away, and there's 4 feet of water where we used to have a bathhouse." "Let's have a very general conversation," Mother said bitterly. "Let's talk about politics or the boat club dance." "As a matter of fact," Lawrence said, "this house is probably in some danger now. If you had an unusually high sea, a hurricane sea, the wall would crumble and the house would go. We could all be drowned." "I can't bear it," Mother said. She went into the pantry and came back with a full glass of gin. "I have grown too old now to think that I can judge the sentiments of others, but I was conscious of the tension between Lawrence and Mother, and I knew some of the history of it. Lawrence couldn't have been more than 16 years old when he decided that Mother was frivolous, mischievous, destructive, and overly strong. When he had determined this, he decided to separate himself from her. He was at boarding school then, and I remember that he did not come home for Christmas. He spent Christmas with a friend. He came home very seldom after he had made his unfavorable judgment on Mother. And when he did come home, he always tried, in his conversation, to remind her of his estrangement. When he married Ruth, he did not tell Mother. He did not tell her when his children were born. But in spite of these principled and lengthy exertions, he seemed, unlike the rest of us, never to have enjoyed any separation. And when they are together, you feel at once a tension, an unclearness. And it was unfortunate, in a way, that Mother should have picked that night to get drunk. It's her privilege, and she doesn't get drunk often, and fortunately she wasn't bellicose, but we were all conscious of what was happening. As she quietly drank her gin, she seemed sadly to be parting from us. She seemed to be in the throes of travel. Then her mood changed from travel to injury, and the few remarks she made were petulant and irrelevant. When her glass was nearly empty, she stared angrily at the dark air in front of her nose, moving her head a little, like a fighter. I knew that there was not room in her mind then for all the injuries that were crowding into it. Her children were stupid, her husband was drowned, her servants were thieves, and the chair she sat in was uncomfortable. Suddenly she put down her empty glass and interrupted Chatty, who was talking about baseball. "I know one thing," she said hoarsely. "I know that if there is an afterlife, I'm going to have a very different kind of family. I'm going to have nothing but fabulously rich, witty, and enchanting children." She got up and, starting for the door, nearly fell. Chatty caught her and helped her up the stairs. I could hear their tender good nights, and then Chatty came back. I thought that Lawrence by now would be tired from his journey and his return, but he remained on the terrace, as if he were waiting to see the final malfeasance, and the rest of us left him there and went swimming in the dark. When I woke the next morning, or half woke, I could hear the sound of someone rolling the tennis court. It is a fainter and deeper sound than the iron buoy bells off the point, an unrhythmic iron chiming that belongs in my mind to the beginnings of a summer day, a good portent. When I went downstairs, Lawrence's 2 kids were in the living room, dressed in ornate cowboy suits. They are frightened and skinny children. They told me their father was rolling the tennis court, but that they did not want to go out because they had seen a snake under the doorstep. I explained to them that their cousins, all the other children, ate breakfast in the kitchen, and that they'd better run along in there. At this announcement, the boy began to cry. Then his sister joined him. They cried as if to go in the kitchen and eat would destroy their precious rights. I told them to sit down with me. Lawrence came in, and I asked him if he wanted to play some tennis. He said no, thanks, although he thought he might play some singles with Chatty. He was in the right here, because both he and Chatty play better tennis than I, and he did play some singles with Chatty after breakfast. But later on, when the others came down to play family doubles, Lawrence disappeared. This made me cross. Unreasonably so, I suppose. But we played darned interesting family doubles, and he could have played in a set for the sake of courtesy. Later in the morning, when I came up from the court alone, I saw Tifty on the terrace, prying a shingle up from the wall with his jackknife. "What's the matter, Lawrence?" I said. "Termites?" "There are termites in the wood, and they've given us a lot of trouble." He pointed out to me, at the base of each row of shingles, a faint blue line of carpenter's chalk. "This house is about 22 years old," he said. "These shingles are about 200 years old. Dad must have bought shingles from all the farms around here when he built the place, to make it look venerable. You can still see the carpenter's chalk put down where these antiques were nailed into place." It was true about the shingles, although I had forgotten it. When the house was built, our father, or his architect, had ordered it covered with lichened and weather-beaten shingles. I didn't follow Lawrence's reasons for thinking that this was scandalous. "And look at these doors," Lawrence said. "Look at these doors and window frames." I followed him over to a big Dutch door that opens onto the terrace and looked at it. It was a relatively new door, but someone had worked hard to conceal its newness. The surface had been deeply scored with some metal implement, and white paint had been rubbed into the incisions to imitate brine, lichen, and weather rot. "Imagine spending thousands of dollars to make a sound house look like a wreck," Lawrence said. "Imagine the frame of mind this implies. Imagine wanting to live so much in the past that you'll pay men carpenters' wages to disfigure your front door." Then I remembered Lawrence's sensitivity to time and his sentiments and opinions about our feelings for the past. I had heard him say, years ago, that we and our friends and our part of the nation, finding ourselves unable to cope with the problems of the present, had, like a wretched adult, turned back to what we supposed was a happier and a simpler time, and that our taste for reconstruction and candlelight was a measure of this irremediable failure. The faint blue line of chalk had reminded him of these ideas. The scarified door had reinforced them, and now clue after clue presented itself to him. The stern light at the door, the bulk of the chimney, the width of the floorboards, and the pieces set into them to resemble pegs. While Lawrence was lecturing me on these frailties, the others came up from the court. As soon as Mother saw Lawrence, she responded, and I saw that there was little hope of any rapport between the matriarch and the changeling. She took Chatty's arm. "Let's go swimming and have martinis on the beach," she said. "Let's have a fabulous morning." The sea that morning was a solid color, like verd stone. Everyone went to the beach but Tifty and Ruth. "I don't mind him," Mother said. She was excited, and she tipped her glass and spilled some gin into the sand. "I don't mind him. It doesn't matter to me how rude and horrid and gloomy he is. But what I can't bear are the faces of his wretched little children, those fabulously unhappy little children." With the height of the cliff between us, everyone talked wrathfully about Lawrence, about how he had grown worse instead of better, how unlike the rest of us he was, how he endeavored to spoil every pleasure. With the height of the cliff between us, everyone talked wrathfully about Lawrence, about how he had grown worse instead of better, how unlike the rest of us he was, how he endeavored to spoil every pleasure. We drank our gin. The abuse seemed to reach a crescendo, and then, one by one, we went swimming in the solid green water. But when we came out, no one mentioned Lawrence unkindly. The line of abusive conversation had been cut, as if swimming had the cleansing force claimed for baptism. We dried our hands and lighted cigarettes, and if Lawrence was mentioned, it was only to suggest, kindly, something that might please him. Wouldn't he like to sail to Barron's Cove or go fishing? And now I remember that while Lawrence was visiting us, we went swimming oftener than we usually do. And I think there was a reason for this. When the irritability that had accumulated as a result of his company began to lessen our patience, not only with Lawrence but with one another, we would all go swimming and shed our animus in the cold water. I can see the family now, smarting from Lawrence's rebukes as they sat on the sand, and I can see them wading and diving and surface diving and hear in their voices the restoration of patience and the rediscovery of inexhaustible goodwill. If Lawrence noticed this change, this illusion of purification, I suppose that he would have found in the vocabulary of psychiatry or the mythology of the Atlantic some circumspect name for it. But I don't think he noticed the change. He neglected to name the curative powers of the open sea, but it was one of those few chances for diminution that he missed. The cook we had that year was a Polish woman named Anna Ostrowiec, a summer cook. She was first-rate, a big, fat, hearty, industrious woman who took her work very seriously. She liked to cook and to have the food she cooked appreciated and eaten, and whenever we saw her, she always urged us to eat. She cooked hot bread, crescents, and brioches for breakfast 2 or 3 times a week, and she would bring these into the dining room herself and say, "Eat, eat, eat." When the maid took the serving dishes back into the pantry, we would sometimes hear Anna, who was standing there, say, "Good, they eat." She fed the garbage man, the milkman, and the gardener. "Eat," she told them. "Eat, eat." On Thursday afternoons, she went to the movies with the maid, but she didn't enjoy the movies because the actors were all so thin. She would sit in the dark theater for an hour and a half, watching the screen anxiously for the appearance of someone who had enjoyed his food. Betty Davis merely left with Anna the impression of a woman who has not eaten well. "They are all so skinny," she would say when she left the movies. In the evenings, after she had gorged all of us and washed the pots and pans, she would collect the table scraps and go out to feed the creation. We had a few chickens that year, and although they would have roosted by then, she would dump food into their trough and urge the sleeping fowl to eat. She fed the songbirds in the orchard and the chipmunks in the yard. Her appearance at the edge of the garden and her urgent voice, we could hear her calling, "Eat, eat, eat," had become like the sunset gun at the boat club and the passage of light from Cape Harion, attached to that hour. "Eat, eat, eat," we could hear Anna say. "Eat, eat. Then it will be dark." When Lawrence had been there 3 days, Anna called me into the kitchen. "You tell your mother," she said, "that he doesn't come into my kitchen. If he comes into my kitchen all the time, I go. He is always coming into my kitchen to tell me what a sad woman I am. He is always telling me that I work too hard and that I don't get paid enough and that I should belong to a union with vacations. Ha! He is so skinny, but he is always coming into my kitchen when I am busy to pity me. But I am as good as him. I am as good as anybody. And I do not have people like that getting into my way all the time and feeling sorry for me. I am a famous and wonderful cook, and I have jobs everywhere, and the only reason I come here to work this summer is because I was never before on an island. But I can have other jobs tomorrow, and if he is always coming into my kitchen to pity me, you tell your mother I am going. I am as good as anybody, and I do not have that skinny all the time telling how poor I am." I was pleased to find that the cook was on our side, but I felt that the situation was delicate. If Mother asked Lawrence to stay out of the kitchen, he would make a grievance out of the request. He could make a grievance out of anything, and it sometimes seemed that as he sat darkly at the dinner table, every word of disparagement, wherever it was aimed, came home to him. I didn't mention the cook's complaint to anyone, but somehow there wasn't any more trouble from that quarter. The next cause for contention that I had from Lawrence came over our backgammon games. When we are at Lod's Head, we play a lot of backgammon. At 8 o'clock, after we have drunk our coffee, we usually get out the board. In a way, it is one of our pleasantest hours. The lamps in the room are still unlighted. Anna can be seen in the dark garden, and in the sky above her head there are continents of shadow and fire. Mother turns on the light and rattles the dice as a signal. We usually play in 3 games apiece, each with the others. We play for money, and you can win or lose $100 in a game. But the stakes are usually much lower. I think that Lawrence used to play. I can't remember. But he doesn't play anymore. He doesn't gamble. This is not because he is poor or because he has any principles about gambling, but because he thinks the game is foolish and a waste of time. He was ready enough, however, to waste his time watching the rest of us play. Night after night, when the game began, he pulled a chair up beside the board and watched the checkers and the dice. His expression was scornful, and yet he watched carefully. I wondered why he watched us night after night, and through watching his face, I think that I may have found out. Lawrence doesn't gamble, so he can't understand the excitement of winning and losing money. He has forgotten how to play the game, I think, so that its complex odds can't interest him. His observations were bound to include the facts that backgammon is an idle game and a game of chance, and that the board, marked with points, was a symbol of our worthlessness. And since he doesn't understand gambling or the odds of the game, I thought that what interested him must be the members of his family. One night, when I was playing with Odette, I had won $37 from Mother and Chatty, I think I saw what was going on in his mind. Odette has black hair and black eyes. She is careful never to expose her white skin to the sun for long, so the striking contrast of blackness and pallor is not changed in the summer. She needs and deserves admiration. It is the element that contents her, and she will flirt unseriously with any man. Her shoulders were bare that night. Her dress was cut to show the division of her breasts, and to show her breasts when she leaned over the board to play. She kept losing and flirting and making her losses seem like a part of the flirtation. Chatty was in the other room. She lost 3 games, and when the 3rd game ended, she fell back on the sofa and, looking at me squarely, said something about going out on the dunes to settle the score. Lawrence heard her. I looked at Lawrence. He seemed shocked and gratified at the same time, as if he suspected all along that we were not playing for anything so insubstantial as money. I may be wrong, of course, but I think that Lawrence felt that in watching our backgammon, he was observing the progress of a mordant tragedy, in which the money we won and lost served as a symbol for more vital forfeits. It is like Lawrence to try to read significance and finality into every gesture that we make, and it is certain of Lawrence that when he finds the inner logic to our conduct, it will be sordid. Chatty came in to play with me. Chatty and I have never liked to lose to each other. When we were younger, we used to be forbidden to play games together, because they always ended in a fight. We think we know each other's mettle intimately. I think he is prudent, he thinks I am foolish. There is always bad blood when we play anything, tennis or backgammon or softball or bridge, and it does seem at times as if we were playing for the possession of each other's liberties. When I lose to Chatty, I can't sleep. All this is only half the truth of our competitive relationship. But it was the half-truth that would be discernible to Lawrence, and his presence at the table made me so self-conscious that I lost 2 games. I tried not to seem angry when I got up from the board. Lawrence was watching me. I went out onto the terrace to suffer there in the dark the anger I always feel when I lose to Chatty. When I came back into the room, Chatty and Mother were playing. Lawrence was still watching. By his lights, Odette had lost her virtue to me, I had lost my self-esteem to Chatty, and now I wondered what he saw in the present match. He watched raptly, as if the opaque checkers and the marked board served for an exchange of critical power. How dramatic the board, in its ring of light and the quiet players and the crash of the sea outside, must have seemed to him. Here was spiritual cannibalism made visible. Here, under his nose, were the symbols of the rapacious use human beings make of one another. Mother plays a shrewd, an ardent, and an interfering game. She always has her hands in her opponent's board. When she plays with Chatty, who is her favorite, she plays intently. Lawrence would have noticed this. Mother is a sentimental woman. Her heart is good and easily moved by tears and frailty, a characteristic that, like her handsome nose, has not been changed at all by age. Grief in another provokes her deeply, and she seems at times to be trying to divine in Chatty some grief, some loss, that she can succor and redress, and so reestablish the relationship that she enjoyed with him when he was sickly and young. She loves defending the weak and the childlike, and now that we are old, she misses it. The world of debts and business, men and war, hunting and fishing, has on her an exacerbating effect. When father drowned, she threw away his fly rods and his guns. She has lectured us all endlessly on self-reliance, but when we come back to her for comfort and for help, particularly Chatty, she seems to feel most like herself. I suppose Lawrence thought that the old woman and her son were playing for each other's soul. She lost. "Oh dear," she said. She looked stricken and bereaved, as she always does when she loses. "Get me my glasses. Get me my checkbook. Get me something to drink." Lawrence got up at last and stretched his legs. He looked at us all bleakly. The wind and the sea had risen, and I thought that if he heard the waves, he must hear them only as a dark answer to all his dark questions, that he would think that the tide had expunged the embers of our picnic fires. The company of a lie is unbearable, and he seemed like the embodiment of a lie. I couldn't explain to him the simple and intense pleasures of playing for money, and it seemed to me hideously wrong that he would have sat at the edge of the board and concluded that we were playing for one another's soul. He walked restlessly around the room 2 or 3 times, and then, as usual, gave us a parting shot. "I should think you'd go crazy," he said, "cooped up with one another like this, night after night. Come on, Ruth. I'm going to bed." That night, I dreamed about Lawrence. I saw his plain face magnified into ugliness, and when I woke in the morning, I felt sick, as if I had suffered a great spiritual loss while I slept, like the loss of courage and heart. It was foolish to let myself be troubled by my brother. I needed a vacation. I needed to relax. At school, we live in one of the dormitories. We eat at the house table, and we never get away. I not only teach English winter and summer, but I work in the principal's office and fire the pistol at track meets. I needed to get away from this and from every other form of anxiety, and I decided to avoid my brother. Early that day, I took Helen and the children sailing, and we stayed out until supper time. The next day, we went on a picnic. Then I had to go to New York for a day, and when I got back, there was the costume dance at the boat club. Lawrence wasn't going to this, and it's a party where I always have a wonderful time. The invitations that year said to come as you wish you were. After several conversations, Helen and I had decided what to wear. The thing she most wanted to be again, she said, was a bride, and so she decided to wear her wedding dress. I thought this was a good choice. Sincere, light-hearted, and inexpensive. Her choice influenced mine, and I decided to wear an old football uniform. Mother decided to go as Jenny Lind, because there was an old Jenny Lind costume in the attic. The others decided to rent costumes, and when I went to New York, I got the clothes. Lawrence and Ruth didn't enter into any of this. Helen was on the dance committee, and she spent most of Friday decorating the club. Diana and Chatty and I went sailing. Most of the sailing that I do these days is in Manhasset, and I am used to setting a homeward course by the gasoline barge and the tin roofs of the boat shed. And it was a pleasure that afternoon, as we returned, to keep the bow on a white church spire in the village and to find even the inshore water green and clear. At the end of our sail, we stopped at the club to get Helen. The committee had been trying to give a submarine appearance to the ballroom, and the fact that they had nearly succeeded in accomplishing this illusion made Helen very happy. We drove back to Laud's Head. It had been a brilliant afternoon, but on the way home we could smell the east wind, the dark wind, as Lawrence would have said, coming in from the sea. My wife, Helen, is 38, and her hair would be gray, I guess, if it were not dyed, but it is dyed in unobtrusive yellow, a faded color, and I think it becomes her. I mixed cocktails that night while she was dressing, and when I took a glass upstairs to her, I saw her for the first time since our marriage in her wedding dress. There would be no point in saying that she looked to me more beautiful than she did on our wedding day, but because I have grown older and have, I think, a greater depth of feeling, and because I could see in her face that night both youth and age, both her devotion to the young woman that she had been and the positions that she had yielded graciously to time, I think I have never been so deeply moved. I had already put on the football uniform, and the weight of it, the heaviness of the pants and the shoulder guards, had worked a change in me, as if in putting on these old clothes I had put off the reasonable anxieties and troubles of my life. It felt as if we had both returned to the years before our marriage, the years before the war. The Collards had a big dinner party before the dance, and our family, excepting Lawrence and Ruth, went to this. We drove over to the club, through the fog, at about 9:30. The orchestra was playing a waltz. While I was checking my raincoat, someone hit me on the back. It was Chucky Ewing, and the funny thing was that Chucky had on a football uniform. This seemed comical as hell to both of us. We were laughing when we went down to the hall to the dance floor. I stopped at the door to look at the party, and it was beautiful. The committee had hung fish nets all around the sides and over the high ceiling. The nets on the ceiling were filled with colored balloons. The light was soft and uneven, and the people, our friends and neighbors, dancing in the soft light to 3:00 in the morning, made a pretty picture. Then I noticed the number of women dressed in white, and I realized that they, like Helen, were wearing wedding dresses. Patsy Hewitt and Miss Gear and a Lackland girl waltzed by, dressed as brides. Then Pep Talcott came over to where Chucky and I were standing. He was dressed to be Henry VIII, but he told us that the Auerbach twins and Henry Barrett and Dwight McGregor were all wearing football uniforms, and that by the last count there were 10 brides on the floor. This funny coincidence, kept everybody laughing and made this one of the most light-hearted parties we'd ever had at the club. At first, I thought that the women had planned with one another to wear wedding dresses, but the ones that I had danced with said it was a coincidence, and I'm sure that Helen had made her decision alone. Everything went smoothly for me until a little before midnight. I saw Ruth standing at the edge of the floor. She was wearing a long red dress. It was all wrong. It wasn't in the spirit of the party at all. I danced with her, but no one cut in, and I was darned if I'd spend the rest of the night dancing with her, and I asked her where Lawrence was. She said he was out on the dock, and I took her over to the bar and left her and went out to get Lawrence. The east fog was wet and thick, and he was alone on the dock. He was not in costume. He had not even bothered to get himself up as a fisherman or a sailor. He looked particularly saturnine. The fog blew around us like a cold smoke. I wished that it had been a clear night, because the easterly fog seemed to play into my misanthropic brother's hands, and I knew that the buoys, the groaners and bells that we could hear then, would sound to him like half-human, half-drowned cries. Although every sailor knows that buoys are necessary and reliable fixtures, and I knew that the foghorn at the lighthouse would mean wanderings and losses to him, and that he could misconstrue the vivacity of the dance music. "Come on in, Tifty," I said, "and dance with your wife, or get her some partners." "Why should I?" he said. "Why should I?" And he walked to the window and looked in at the party. "Look at it," he said. "Look at that." Chucky Ewing had got a hold of a balloon and was trying to organize a scrimmage line in the middle of the floor. The others were dancing a samba, and I knew that Lawrence was looking bleakly at the party as he had looked at the weather-beaten shingles on our house, as if he saw here an abuse and a distortion of time. As if in wanting to be brides and football players, we exposed the fact that the lights of youth had been put out in us. We had been unable to find other lights to go by, and, destitute of faith and principle, had become foolish and sad. And that he was thinking this about so many kind and happy and generous people made me angry, made me feel for him such an unnatural abhorrence that I was ashamed, for he is my brother and a Pomeroy. I put my arm around his shoulders and tried to force him to come in, but he wouldn't. I got back in time for the Grand March, and after the prizes had been given out for the best costumes, they let the balloons down. The room was hot, and someone opened the big doors onto the dock, and the easterly wind circled the room and went out, carrying across the dock and out onto the water most of the balloons. Chucky Ewing went running out after the balloons, and when he saw them pass the dock and settle on the water, he took off his football uniform and dove in. Then Eric Auerbach dove in, and Lou Phillips dove in, and I dove in. And you know how it is at a party after midnight when people start jumping into the water. We recovered most of the balloons and dried off and went on dancing, and we didn't get home until morning. The next day was the day of the flower show. Mother and Helen and Odette all had entries. We had a pickup lunch, and Chatty drove the women and children over to the show. I took a nap, and in the middle of the afternoon, I got some trunks and a towel and, on leaving the house, passed Ruth in the laundry. She was washing clothes. I don't know why she should seem to have so much more work to do than anyone else, but she is always washing or ironing or mending clothes. She may have been taught, when she was young, to spend her time like this, or she may be at the mercy of an expiatory passion. She seems to scrub and iron with a penitential fervor, although I can't imagine what it is that she thinks she's done wrong. Her children were with her in the laundry. I offered to take them to the beach, but they didn't want to go. It was late in August, and the wild grapes that grow profusely all over the island made the land wind smell of wine. There was a little grove of holly at the end of the path, and then you climb the dunes, where nothing grows but that coarse grass. I could hear the sea, and I remember thinking how Chatty and I used to talk mystically about the sea. When we were young, we had decided that we could never live in the West because we would miss the sea. "It is very nice here," we used to say politely when we visited people in the mountains, but we miss the Atlantic. We used to look down our noses at people from Iowa and Colorado who had been denied this revelation, and we scorned the Pacific. Now I could hear the waves, whose heaviness sounded like a reverberation, like a tumult, and it pleased me as it had pleased me when I was young, and it seemed to have a purgative force, as if it had cleared my memory of, among other things, the penitential image of Ruth in the laundry. But Lawrence was on the beach. There he sat. I went in without speaking. The water was cold, and when I came out, I put on a shirt. I told him that I was going to walk up to Tanner's Point, and he said that he would come with me. I tried to walk beside him. His legs are no longer than mine, but he always likes to stay a little ahead of his companion. Walking along behind him, looking at his bent head and his shoulders, I wondered what he could make of that landscape. There were the dunes and cliffs, and then, where they declined, there were some fields that had begun to turn from green to brown and yellow. The fields were used for pasturing sheep, and I guess Lawrence would have noticed that the soil was eroded and that the sheep would accelerate this decay. Beyond the fields, there are a few coastal farms, with square and pleasant buildings, but Lawrence could have pointed out the hard lot of an island farmer. The sea, at our other side, was the open sea. We always tell guests that there, to the east, lies the coast of Portugal, and for Lawrence it would be an easy step from the coast of Portugal to the tyranny in Spain. The waves broke with a noise like a hurrah, hurrah, hurrah. But to Lawrence they would say, wale, wale. I suppose it would have occurred to his baleful and incisive mind that the coast was terminal moraine, the edge of the prehistoric world, and it must have occurred to him that we walked along the edge of the known world in spirit as much as in fact. If he should otherwise have overlooked this, there were some Navy planes bombing an uninhabited island to remind him. That beach is a vast and preternaturally clean and simple landscape. It is like a piece of the moon. The surf had pounded the floor solid, so it was easy walking, and everything left on the sand had been twice changed by the waves. There was the spine of a shell, a broomstick, part of a bottle, and part of a brick, both of them milled and broken until they were nearly unrecognizable. And I suppose Lawrence's sad frame of mind, for he kept his head down, went from one broken thing to another. The company of his pessimism began to infuriate me, and I caught up with him and put a hand on his shoulder. "It's only a summer day, Tifty," I said. "It's only a summer day. What's the matter? Don't you like it here?" "I don't like it here," he said blandly, without raising his eyes. "I'm going to sell my equity in the house to Chatty. I didn't expect to have a good time. The only reason I came back was to say goodbye." I let him get ahead again, and I walked behind him, looking at his shoulders and thinking of all the goodbyes he had made. When Father drowned, he went to church and said goodbye to Father. It was only 3 years later that he concluded that Mother was frivolous and said goodbye to her. In his freshman year at college, he had been very good friends with his roommate, but the man drank too much, and at the beginning of the spring term, Lawrence changed roommates and said goodbye to his friend. When he had been in college for 2 years, he concluded that the atmosphere was too sequestered, and he said goodbye to Yale. He enrolled at Columbia and got his law degree there, but he found his first employer dishonest, and at the end of 6 months, he said goodbye to a good job. He married Ruth in City Hall and said goodbye to the Protestant Episcopal Church. They went to live on a back street in Tuckahoe and said goodbye to the middle class. In 1938, he went to Washington to work as a government lawyer, saying goodbye to private enterprise. But after 8 months in Washington, he concluded that the Roosevelt administration was sentimental, and he said goodbye to it. They left Washington for a suburb of Chicago, where he said goodbye to his neighbors, one by one, on counts of drunkenness, boorishness, and stupidity. He said goodbye to Chicago and went to Kansas. He said goodbye to Kansas and went to Cleveland. Now he said goodbye to Cleveland and come east again, stopping at Laud's Head long enough to say goodbye to the sea. It was elegiac, and it was bigoted and narrow. It mistook circumspection for character, and I wanted to help him. "Come out of it," I said. "Come out of it, Tifty." "Come out of what?" "Come out of this gloominess. Come out of it. It's only a summer day. You're spoiling your own good time, and you're spoiling everyone else's. We need a vacation, Tifty. I need one. I need to rest. We all do. And you've made everything tense and unpleasant. I only have 2 weeks in the year. 2 weeks. I need to have a good time, and so do all the others. We need to rest. You think that your pessimism is an advantage, but it's nothing but an unwillingness to grasp realities." "What are the realities?" he said. "Diana is a foolish and a promiscuous woman. So is Odette. Mother is an alcoholic. If she doesn't discipline herself, she'll be in a hospital in a year or 2. Chatty is dishonest. He has always been. The house is going to fall into the sea." He looked at me and added, as an afterthought, "You're a fool." "You're a gloomy son of a bitch," I said. "You're a gloomy son of a bitch." "Get your fat face out of mine," he said. He walked along. Then I picked up a root and, coming at his back, although I have never hit a man from the back before, I swung the root, heavy with seawater, behind me, and the momentum sped my arm, and I gave him, my brother, a blow on the head that forced him to his knees on the sand. And I saw the blood come out and begin to darken his hair. Then I wished that he was dead and about to be buried. Not buried, but about to be buried, because I did not want to be denied ceremony and decorum in putting him away, in putting him out of my consciousness. And I saw the rest of us, Chatty and Mother and Diana and Helen, in mourning in the house on Belvedere Street that was torn down 20 years ago, greeting our guests and our relatives at the door and answering their mannerly condolences with mannerly grief. Nothing decorous was lacking, so that even if he had been murdered on a beach, one would feel before the tiresome ceremony ended that he had come into the winter of his life, and that it was a law of nature, and a beautiful one, that Tifty should be buried in the cold, cold ground. He was still on his knees. I looked up and down. No one had seen us. The naked beach, like a piece of the moon, reached to invisibility. The spill of a wave in a glancing run shot up to where he knelt. I still would have liked to end him, but now I had begun to act like two men, the murderer and the Samaritan. With a swift roar, like hollowness made sound, a white wave reached him and encircled him, boiling over his shoulders, and I held him against the undertow. Then I led him to a higher place. The blood had spread all through his hair, so that it looked black. I took off my shirt and tore it up to bind his head. He was conscious, and I didn't think he was badly hurt. He didn't speak. Neither did I. Then I left him there. I walked a little way down the beach and turned to watch him, and I was thinking of my own skin then. He had got to his feet, and he seemed steady. The daylight was still clear, but on the sea wind, fumes of brine were blowing in like a light fog. And when I had walked a little way from him, I could hardly see his dark figure in this obscurity. All down the beach, I could see the heavy salt air blowing in. Then I turned my back on him, and as I got near to the house, I went swimming again, as I seemed to have done after every encounter with Lawrence that summer. When I got back to the house, I lay down on the terrace. The others came back. I could hear Mother defaming the flower arrangements that had won prizes. None of ours had won anything. When the house quieted, as it always does at that hour, the children went into the kitchen to get supper, and the others went upstairs to bathe. Then I heard Chatty making cocktails, and the conversation about the flower show judges was resumed. Then Mother cried, "Tifty! Tifty! Oh, Tifty!" He stood in the door, looking half dead. He had taken off the bloody bandage, and he held it in his hand. "My brother did this," he said. "My brother did it. He hit me with a stone, something on the beach." His voice broke with self-pity. I thought he was going to cry. No one else spoke. "Where's Ruth?" he cried. "Where's Ruth? Where in the hell is Ruth? I want her to start packing. I don't have any more time to waste here. I have important things to do. I have important things to do." And he went up the stairs. They left for the mainland the next morning, taking the 6:00 boat. Mother got up to say goodbye, but she was the only one. And it is a harsh and an easy scene to imagine. The matriarch and the changeling, looking at each other with a dismay that would seem like the powers of love reversed. I heard the children's voices and the cars go down the drive, and I got up and went to the window. And what a morning that was! Jesus, what a morning! The wind was northerly, the air was clear. In the early heat, the roses in the garden smelled like strawberry jam. While I was dressing, I heard the boat whistle. First the warning signal, and then the double blast. And I could see the good people on the top deck drinking coffee out of fragile paper cups. And Lawrence at the bow saying to the sea, "Thalassa, Thalassa," while his timid and unhappy children watched the creation from the encirclement of their mother's arms. The buoys would toll mournfully for Lawrence, and while the grace of the light would make it an exertion not to throw out your arms and swear exultantly, Lawrence's eyes would trace the black sea as it fell astern. He would think of the bottom, dark and strange, where full fathom 5 our Father lies. Oh, what can you do with a man like that? What can you do? How can you dissuade his eye in a crowd from seeking out the cheek with acne, the infirm hand? How can you teach him to respond to the inestimable greatness of the race, the harsh surface beauty of life? How can you put his finger for him on the obdurate truths before which fear and horror are powerless? The sea that morning was iridescent and dark. My wife and my sister were swimming, Diana and Helen, and I saw their uncovered heads, black and gold in the dark water. I saw them come out, and I saw that they were naked, unshy, beautiful, and full of grace. And I watched the naked women walk out of the sea.